Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of That Early Childhood Nerd. I'm Heather Burnt-Santee, and joining me on this episode is Mike Huber.
Hello.
Yay, Mike Huber, who I've met in real life now.
I know it's weird seeing you on a screen again. Like, oh,
That was fun.
who knew that
Everybody,
you had legs or that I had legs?
right?
I
Anyway,
am, yeah, I am realizing that my background is my closet right now because I'm not totally moved into my new place. So
yeah, it doesn't look bad. You can blur it if you want to. This is fascinating pod so far. For all the listeners. So, hey everybody, Mike has a new book that's coming out by the time this episode comes out. Is it coming out in October?
it's actually November
It's in November.
14th.
Yeah, it's like a lot of my pre-orders are all coming in November, so I'm going to get slammed with all these new books. Although I've read yours already, but I'm still getting another copy and highlighting it up. Anyway, so we're going to talk a little bit about the book, which is called Mike, you probably know, but Inclusion Includes Us, Building Bridges and Removing Barriers in Early Childhood Classrooms from Red Leaf Press. So I'll just, before we start our conversation, I'll put a plug in that I think everybody needs this book. Like anyone who's listening and really loved Illuminating Care and your mind was blown by Illuminating Care, I think this is going to be right along those lines too. Really has potential to really impact the way we think and talk about inclusion.
I hope so.
Yeah. Okay. So let's just jump in. One of the things that you introduced me to in the book that I hadn't heard of or thought about was a social model of disability. So you say the social model views disability as a societal problem rather than an individual problem. Individuals may have impairments, but the disability comes from the barriers in society. And that was so interesting to me that I just want to hear you talk about it.
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe I'll start with the way I wrote this book.
Mm-hmm.
One is that I work at a center that's based on is an inclusive childcare. And that's a phrase that gets used a lot. And so having to figure out, are we actually including children?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the writing, you kind of get steered to is special education literature, especially in the United States, right? That's the phrase, special education. And what I started doing was looking at more from the disability rights community of what, kind of, so from the ground up rather than these like, here's what the experts say. It's like, here's what the people who experience things say.
Yeah.
And so listening to a podcast that at the time was called Ouch, and I should know what their current title is. It's a BBC production now called, do I have it handy? Access All.
Oh, okay.
And what I like about it, the hosts are disabled, and then they interview other people. And so they interviewed somebody actually who wrote a song about the social model.
Oh, wow.
I didn't know what it was. And then they had Tom Shakespeare, who is one of the creators of the concept, come on briefly. But basically, I was kind of blown away. Like, right, like we're trying to remove barriers because that's what prevents kids from being included or feeling like they belong.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I thought that Tom Shakespeare did so well is that he talks about the three basic barriers are either physical, informational, or attitudinal. And I kind of, the physical one, everyone's ready for it. Of course, there has to be enough room for the wheelchair if a kid has a wheelchair. Although the kid who needs to move around for, their sense of learning where their body begins and ends, or for whatever need, that one often gets shut down, right?
Mm-hmm.
So physical, and then
also
sensory
needs that space.
Yeah, they need the same space, and then sensory needs we sometimes don't notice. Like the lights are this bright because that's, I want kids to be able to see what they're doing. It's like, but are some children getting affected? Are they lights that buzz and you filter out that buzz, but some kids can't, some adults can't? So started looking at that, but then the informational barriers, he was really talking about everything in society, right? What prevents you from joining something? So if you can't read the sign, because you're blind, how can you get the same information? If you need a map of a place, how do you get that map in a way that you don't have to see it with your eyes? And then in thinking about early childhood classrooms, then, well, that's a lot of what we do. Kids don't have the information, and kids can't read already. So that we know that part. But then what do we do for kids to give them the information? We sort of assume that, well, after a week, they should know the schedule. It's like, that's not true. Like, what 3-year-old has the capacity to remember a schedule, or remember that they have to wash their hands after they're done using the bathroom? Like, we have such a grown-up view of it. Like, well, of course they know. Right. I've told them 3 times.
Everybody else knows.
And everybody else knows, right?
Yeah.
And I always feel like there are the kids who will remember literally in their head. There are the kids who just follow what the other kids are doing. Like, oh yeah, my friend is washing his hands, so I must wash my hands.
Yeah.
And then there's the kid who loves washing their hands because they like the feel of water, but they get told to stop, playing in the water, turn off the sink. It's like, wait, you just told those kids they have to wash their hands. And when I go to do it, you tell me not to.
Yeah.
And then you have the kid who has no idea unless there's a visual, and you have the kid who needs you to tell them each time, preferably also pointing, because kids usually need more than just a verbal cue, even children who have typical hearing and things. So just that part really kind of made me think about all the stuff that I've noticed works, or in universal design tends to happen. Visual schedules, visuals for children who have a hard time controlling their emotions, expressing them in ways that aren't hurtful. Visuals work much better than telling a child something. And so it's like, oh, for early childhood, that's the informational. And then attitudinal, so many things that we do are based on the teacher's attitudes of what children should do. So I was actually just looking at your matching game. I'm going to be using it with some people next week. So the idea is, what do you do when a child, can't, or puts a puzzle piece in the wrong place? And then the choices of what you would do are all things we would do to kids for behaviors, like, tell them it made you sad, or get angry, or whatever, all the different things.
And we tell mom.
Yeah. And so that's the attitude. If we have the attitude that behavior issues, quote unquote, are simply children, not a developmental thing, just as children sometimes aren't tall enough to reach the water fountain. Sometimes they're not able to, what would be the word, express their emotions verbally only, in that same developmental way. And yet one of them we just treat as like a moral deficit, and one we treat as it's just, they have to grow bigger, typical, obviously.
Just get a footstool. Of course we'll get a footstool if he's too short.
I know there's a Dan, what is it, behavior problems become moral issues, or something?
Stop turning developmental issues into moral issues, Dan Hodgins used to always say.
So basically going to that. The one thing I've added to Tom Shakespeare's idea of that social model is the cultural barriers that happen too for kids to feel included. So, and obviously some of that's attitudinal, but some of it is just being aware, because we all have our own culture that we're immersed in. So like eye contact is one that's really common. I grew up in a white middle class family, that fairly typical for white middle class people, that eye contact shows you're paying attention. But there's plenty of cultures that that's not true. And yet if the teacher and the child are in different cultures, a teacher insisting on a child looking at them, or just having that attitude, getting upset because the child isn't looking at them,
or assuming that looking at me means that I'm teaching you something.
Yes. Thank you. That too.
Outside of the whether it's respectful, whatever other kinds of things we hook to eye contact, we also tend to assume, well, if they're sitting still and looking at me, then automatically they're learning what I'm telling them. And
so I just realized I didn't talk about the other part of that event. So the social model is simply that if we get rid of those barriers, more people will be able to be included. And that's accessibility. Accessibility is something we do for everyone. There may still need to be accommodations. I might not be able to see without my glasses, for instance. And the difference is, accommodation is something you do. It's for one person. right? Accessibility means that, everyone can benefit from it or take part in it. And then there's things that are like, nope, that wheelchair is just for this child, or the glasses are just for that child. So,
and I imagine somewhere in one of those levels, the idea of invisible disability fits. Like that's in one of those things.
For
categories
sure.
You just listed off. And you said, in the book, you also said you don't need to know the medical diagnosis of a child who uses a wheelchair. Just consider whether they can access all the areas. And then you said the same is true for mental health and neurodivergence. Like the wheelchair user is kind of obvious. They need some kind of consideration, but trauma or mental health or neurodivergence sometimes, because they don't have that physical appearance.
Right.
Of a
and that's where you need to be attuned to the kids, right? Notice, boy, no matter how many times I say it's time to put on your shoes, that child doesn't put on their shoes. That should tell you, if once you've said it more than 2 times, the information is the way I'm trying to convey information is not working.
Yeah.
And me as the adult in this needs to figure out what would work.
Right.
Yeah.
And instead of assuming,
do they need to wear shoes?
That's true too. Looking at our expectations.
Yeah. But you look at what's the ultimate goal here? Am I worried about certain dangers? Often it's more about, well, what if there's a fire and we all have to go outside? So, Lisa Murphy talked about have the bucket with the shoes in it. But it's true that actually most kids, or many kids, are going to be more comfortable without shoes on. Their balance is actually going to be better. They'll actually be able to do more, engage more of their motor skills without shoes on. We have people wear shoes because we were told that's what we're supposed to do, because somebody's worried about the 1 in,
million
chance that there might be a fire. And the only way we can deal with it is if children wear their shoes at all times.
I hate wearing shoes. I hate it for myself. Why would I force someone else?
Right. First thing you do when you get home, like kick off your shoes, it just, so it's that attitude and just noticing, if this isn't working, that's all the information I need. I don't need to diagnose whether the child has autism or ADHD or just culturally there's something different going on. Because, for some kids, walking inside with your shoes on is weird.
Rude. And people would see it as being rude.
So, so having to be aware of those things and notice. And so what can I do instead? And, some of that's choosing your, the power, struggle sort of thing. Like, is this the hill to die on? But a lot of times it's like, you'll actually get to know the kid better. Of like, there's one kid in one of the classrooms right now that she takes off her shoes when she goes outside. She hasn't been lately. It's also been in the low 30s Fahrenheit lately. So, but she would take off her shoes and then she'd be climbing in these ways that none of the other kids can do. And she's like one of the younger kids. And, she's doing it because she couldn't do this. If she had shoes on, it is hard to
really zoom in on a child who's climbing with no shoes on, and like take a picture of the foot and how their toes are curled around and the whole foot kind of grabs, and that just can't be done with shoes on.
And if you think about it, if we gave kids, okay, here's some scissors, we want you to learn to cut, by the way, you have to wear mittens while you do this, we would never do that. And so those are those early childhood cultural things that we forget. Like if you would have talked to most architects in 1975 that, we can't just have stairs that go up to the entrance. There's got to be a way for people to enter without stairs. Architects would tell you there's no way we can do that. That would be too expensive. People wouldn't do it. Same thing with curb cuts on sidewalks. In fact, when the ADA was passed, mostly what people were arguing against was, it's way too expensive. We can't do this as a society, that goes back to the societal model, right? Which was coming about around the same time of like, well, that's a choice. We've chosen to not spend money on that. Because you could say, it'd be cheaper if we didn't put a roof on the building. Right. And then people,
Yes.
oh, but then we'll get rained on.
Right.
Oh, so we do have to spend some money to meet the needs of people. So let's think about what are the needs of all the people if we included everyone. And I think one of the bigger things I've learned from reading more from the disability community, and not that it's one viewpoint, but
right.
you know, but just that idea that when you're not being inclusive, we really need to use the word include. We're not including some people, which means we are excluding people. So when we don't put curb cuts on sidewalks, we are excluding certain people. When we only have stairs as the entrance, we are excluding people. And so we have to decide if that's okay or not.
Right.
Right. But I think if we put that language in there and make it about our society, then that changes the name of the game. So yeah.
Yeah. I think one of the other big takeaways I had from reading this was just, I hadn't thought about how different inclusion and belonging are. Like we just assume that it's the same thing. Well, I've included you here, so of course you belong. We've allowed you to bring your disability into this space.
Right.
So you belong here now. You should feel like you belong.
Yes, right.
And it doesn't.
You're in the same room. What more do you want?
Yeah.
And then that's where having those different types of barriers, I think, can really help with that. I do want to make sure I talk about that word impairment a bit, because I think it's important to say there are medical realities for people that are also important to acknowledge, but still figuring out how do we include people. So I start the book with the story of having a child with CF, who needed the, I don't know what you call it, the percussion thing in the morning.
Therapy.
So mom, percussive therapy. Thank you. Mom would sometimes be late and be very apologetic. Oh, it took longer today or something. And I'm thinking, why should she feel like she has to apologize because she's doing this procedure on her child that will help her child live?
Right. Let alone, yes, exactly.
And participate like that. Like, what message is our society giving? What message am I giving? Right. Because, I'm sure I had something about like, oh, we should all show up by 9:30 because we do our,
because that's when learning starts.
Song. Well, I don't think I would have said that, but I would have talked about
that's,
community.
I think, a common.
Yeah, sure. But I would have talked about community. Oh, we sing our morning song and then talk about what's happening today. So it's, she should really be there, or all the kids should be there. I didn't say it to the one mom, but mom took that as, oh no. So now I always want to make sure I preface that, if at all possible, you should get there for that, because it's a way some kids really get that sense of belonging by singing together or something like that. If you're unable to, let me know. We can figure out, because children, in fact, can sing at other times. But my head wasn't there. My attitude at the time was not there. It was like, well, I can't change what I do. Like, I'm trying to include you by telling you what I'm doing and not changing anything.
Yeah.
And that's kind of
a big sigh. I told you inclusion wouldn't work. It's disruptive.
Right. And then, yeah.
Yeah. And so I know you've heard this story already, but it reminds, that the story of the child with cystic fibrosis that you opened the book with. So I have a friend whose daughter has spina bifida and uses a wheelchair and goes to an elementary school. And parents in the pickup line were complaining because Melissa, being up front with her van to let her get her daughter out and get the wheelchair set up, was slowing down the whole pickup and drop off line. And so the parents complained to the principal, and the principal's initial solution was, well, you could just take your van around back where the buses park and bring her in that way. And so I thought that was a good example of, they're including her. Technically, they're including her. She still gets to come to school there, but they're also sending a very clear message to the other parents that there's something really weird and different about this child. And it is inconvenient. And I'm sorry, we've made, you won't see her again. She's going to be in the back.
And that child is like, oh, sure. Yeah.
Come in, the message to then my friend and her daughter is, you're included, but we're going to hide you because it's inconvenient for the rest of the school family.
And without changing anything else, it could have been, yeah, if you don't want to wait, there's an entrance in back
right
that you're welcome to go to. And any family that really wanted, because, and there might be an honest reason for someone else,
right,
like I don't know if a family is using homeless shelters, depending on the city, like a lot of times you have to be there at 11 o'clock or whatever time for that city to get a room. So that parent might be dropping off to get over there so they have a place to sleep that night. That's possible. And,
but let's figure it all out, because then it's it's a belonging element for that family. Okay, we didn't realize this was your barrier.
Right.
Let's work to fix both.
Yeah. So when people complain,
let's work to include both.
Yeah. What you want to do is ask, tell me more about that. How is it affecting your family? Or how is it affecting your child? Or what is your concern? Or, like any of that is so important. So, yeah.
But we just skip to, oh yeah, you're right. This is a problem. Let's roll her around to the back.
Right. And so when I say that, we have the barriers, we have the social models. So in this school, maybe it is only those 2 entrances, but maybe with just a little more thought, there's several entrances. I mean, the pandemic did that to my center when we didn't want parents to have to, like, parents dropped off to an adult from our, on staff to bring them in the building. So people aren't going in, but we couldn't all do that from the front entrance. And it turns out we have doors everywhere.
Yeah.
Right. So then it was just, oh, if you're in this program, because we have autism day treatment, mental health day treatment, therapies, although a lot of the therapies weren't done in person for a while, but it was suddenly like, oh, if you're in that program, you go to those doors. If you're in that program, go to those doors. And we had the doors were always there. And it required adults being there. So like now that we aren't doing that, we are back to everyone uses the front entrance, because then the front desk actually knows where you're supposed to go and can connect you. Like there's reasons for it, but if an issue arises, like sometimes it's already there. The thing you don't need to change much to do it. And sometimes you might have to change a lot. And this is where, early childhood programs often are in old buildings,
right?
Churches, things where you might not be able to physically change your building. So then you have to figure out, now what do we do? How do we figure this out? But hopefully as a society, well, obviously with ADA, things have changed a lot, but when something new is built, figuring out, okay, so now how do we make that accessible? But even when you're rearranging your room, you can start to think of some of that, but at least identify the barriers and know, oh, this thing I can't change. So now I've got a problem solve. I got to talk to the family. Maybe they have ideas. Like, what have they done elsewhere? Or
the family would be such a great resource for that conversation.
Right.
Because this probably isn't the first time they've encountered some sort of accessibility, physical accessibility.
And if you're able to say, well, these are the things I was able to change, but this part, it's the building itself, and we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars to renovate the building. We can't do that now. It would be great to know, what can we do now? And if the building ever is renovated, we'll make sure to make those changes or whatever, but to always be aware of what could happen. And that's like society as a whole has to make those changes. And so like I'm never, like when I write stuff, the hard part of writing a book is you finish it months before it comes out.
And then you forget what's at the beginning of it.
But also like now I'm thinking about a different thing. I'm so bad at, like, because authors, what you're supposed to do is pretend you just wrote it and this is what you're talking about. And maybe for some things that's what I'll do. But I feel like, with talking to you, when we were at the IPA USA to play right now conference, one thing came up to me because people kept talking about problems they were running into. This is at like the unconference portion. It's kind of unpacking what we did. And it was about, we're trying to get play in these schools and they can't, because of basically that same idea of the social model, right? That There's this one person from Australia who had this program where they would go into the school and do all this outdoor play with kids, right? And they could teach kids how to do different, stuff outside. And they kept getting turned down because, oh, well, that's when we get our reading hours in. Right. And so it was this thing of, it was built in where we need reading hours for these kids. And we've decided it's going to be at this time, and we cannot change that. Just like I cannot change doing a song with my kids just because your child is CF. Like it's a very similar like problem of like, you set up this thing that like they didn't intentionally say we better put reading time then, that therefore kids won't be going outside. Like it wasn't done to prevent a child, but then now it's not including play. So this is a little different in terms of inclusion, but I think the social model of disability, of disabling children from playing or playing outside because, oh, well, we need to do this. And it's like, really? You can't, because the program was free. That's the other part about this. Is there are these educators coming in to work with the kids and show the teachers of all this stuff you can do outdoors. And yet you can't do it because you have decided that these hours are used for this. And, institutions in general have a hard time changing, but even a small program would often say, oh, we can't do it. And then it's like, we need people. I remember and I'm going to forget the person's name or which book, but in a book about special education said, we do best when we have sort of an ad hoc approach to things like, oh, because each disability is different,
right?
And we need to be able to deal with the person in front of us, not like, oh, well, other wheelchair users do this. Oh, this wheelchair user doesn't have the use of their hands, and so the wheelchair is operated differently. Like, oh, okay, we got to change what we do for this person. And so that approach is going to meet the needs better when you're used to doing that. And part of that is that parallel process of our teachers given the power to figure things out on their own.
Right. Because otherwise they feel like they have that freedom, that agency.
That agency. And then they can, oh, I see this child is having a hard time doing this. What if I just put their shoes in the emergency backpack when they're playing? Like, do they have to wait for an administrator to tell them that's okay? Or do they just, oh, I've noticed this, so I just did it. And I noticed this kid likes to play in the water, so I asked them to wash the paintbrushes every day. So, they're whatever. A teacher should feel that way, and then you're going to meet the needs of the different needs of the kids. And the more regimented you get, the less likely you're going to be excluding more people the more regimented you are. And then with this play analogy, similarly, you might be excluding certain types of engagement.
Right. I used to say a lot, every child has special needs. So if we're seeing it that way, it won't be difficult to include, whatever the diagnosis is or whatever. And I know that that's oversimplified, but it was a good soundbite. Well, I was talking to people, but I think part of the barrier too is that American childcare culture at least tends to really think about the group and moving the group through things and getting the group. So anything that makes you as a teacher go outside the group is seen as an inconvenience or seen as a bad reflection of you as a teacher.
Right.
And so I think that's part of moving away. Another thing we need to try and move away from is like, the more we can think about what the individuals in our group need, the better we'll be prepared when those needs are a little bit more difficult to meet, or there's a little bit more problem solving involved.
And I think that's why I brought up the kid who plays in the sink, because it could be for a diagnosable reason, but it might not be. But it's like, can we allow, oh, this kid likes to do this? Because if a child liked to sit and read, we would probably just would let them do that, right? Oh, okay, no problems here. The child likes to sit and read, which was my kid. What my child needed help with was socializing, because they also like to do things with other kids, but they didn't know how. And the autism diagnosis came years later, but people weren't necessarily attuned to, oh, I wonder if there's a skill this child needs help developing. Right.
Yeah.
And so it was just like, well, they're reading, so that's okay. Had they been like doing something that was considered non-academic, I'm sure it would have been like, oh, we got to get this kid
back in the group.
Back in the group. Like you can't just be climbing things. Like, that it's not time to climb anymore.
Yeah.
But so we have those like biases, and we just have to be aware of what biases we have and what we want.
Yeah. Practicing a pause, right? Like before you react to anything, just thinking, okay, wait, why not?
Right.
And if your immediate answer is, well, I've got to get the rest of the group already has their coats on and we've got to get outside or whatever.
Right.
Or the playground is only ours for the next 20 minutes. And then, so we've got to move that. But so in the immediate, it might be, okay, we just need to move through this. But then you can think, okay, so thinking about outside time in general and, or thinking about movement needs in general, what can we do here?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And you might not be able to, sometimes you can solve something in the moment.
Right.
Right. Like if you're telling a kid to put on their coat over and over.
Take the coat.
Just take the coat. Yeah. Sometimes it is more like, oh, we're not getting enough movement. What can I do to change my schedule or coordinate with other classrooms or whatever it is that you have to do. So sometimes you can do things in the moment and sometimes you need that broader thing, just like figuring out what entrance to use when, the van, the wheelchair van is taking longer. It will take longer, right? So it's like, is there a way to do it that like a long-term change, that might be whatever it is. I don't know. I mean, it's hard to know without knowing the driveway, but there's plenty of options. I'm sure there couldn't have just been only, it's either
two
this
doors.
or this.
Yeah. I haven't heard the final solution.
That's fine.
I know they're working on it, but
so I think just the social model, once you kind of start to think about it, it can make you think about a lot of things, because it really, all it is doing is saying, it's so easy for us to just blame the person, the child has the challenging behavior. It's like, well, no, do they? Or is it, there's a societal, there's the classroom culture that's creating this problem. Right. And there might be issues, but sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, and everyone that's listening heard you say, well, we can blame the child, and reacted like, oh, I would never blame the child. But that's the reality. We don't use that language, but we start to think about this child is creating the problem.
Right. And so I'm going to use an example of a child.
Figure out this child, my days would be so much better.
Right. We have this child who was definitely displaying some, like during lunchtime, just like would get up from the table and go onto a shelf and stand up. Or like different things, like that. But it often involved like standing on a shelf, or I guess at some point spilling, dumping things out and things. And it's like a 4.5-year-old. And I was in the room that day and trying to figure it out a little bit and thinking everything that the child was doing was basically forcing an adult to be near him. Right? And it was like, what's wrong with this kid? Like, what, just like essentially blaming the kid, right? Later that night, and this is one thing about filling in a classroom where I don't know all the information, but later that night, his mom had his, new baby sister.
Oh.
That was very relevant information, right? Of
that
like,
would change the conversation.
This kid is trying to draw adults to him, and he knows you can ignore me if I'm just saying poop over and over. But if I'm standing on a shelf, you're going to come over.
Right. Or if I get that connection that I'm seeking.
Yeah, exactly. And so had the attitude, including mine, and this is just this week, so I'm not saying that I'm, was like, boy, what like doesn't he understand about like classroom norms? Or is there a sensory thing that like, did he not get enough time, climbing earlier, or, I was trying to figure out all these things. And then, afterwards, like, oh yeah, he really wanted an adult with them. Because at one point I just said, hey, I have an idea. Do you want to sit across from me for lunch? He's like, okay.
Yeah.
And as soon as I got up to like pour milk for somebody else or something, I can't remember what I went to do. He was over dumping out toys. And it was like, but in the moment, because I'm also paying attention to,
you do have to pay attention to the
other
group.
kids or whatever it was at the time. Like, oh, right. Like that was when that's when he stopped sitting in the chair, was as soon as I left. He was within, in retrospect, within seconds, probably. I didn't notice right away because I was talking to another child, but it's like, oh yeah. And especially like, oh, his mom is like probably
preoccupied.
Not able to give him the same attention that he's used to or whatever. It's like, right. So he needs more adult attention from someone else.
Yeah.
And our choice was, could we figure out a way to give him more? She's like, oh, hey, I've got to go pour milk. Do you want to help me pour milk? Could you pour the milk for him? Because he's an older kid. He probably could have done it. I could have walked over with him, given him the milk to pour, whatever. And those of you in states that have stricter, licensing requirements, maybe, oh my God, what about the food service gloves? Or
yes,
whatever? But,
it's all workable.
It's all workable, yeah, for sure. But I could have had him just had it in my mind, oh, he needs to be with me or with another adult at all times right now to have that like attention. Or I could have kept a conversation with him while I physically went to do something else.
Sure, yeah.
Right. But I wasn't realizing what he needed. But in a way, our classrooms, like, I'm assuming Indiana's the same. In Minnesota, in early childhood classrooms, all the children eat lunch at the same time. And they all sit at tables kind of like right next to each other.
Very crowded.
Very crowded. When I go to like a more of a cafeteria style restaurant where there's those tables with like 6 seats with the idea that you just sit and other people will sit next to you. I avoid those, and I'm like looking for like
immediate
where's
stress.
the 2-person table, and I'm worried like, oh, this is a 4-person table. That still might invite people if it's busy enough. Why did I even come when there's people here, right? So like, if adults won't do it, and some adults will, some adults are like, oh great, I get to sit here and talk to people I don't know. Which I'm known to do at times, don't get me wrong. But it's this thing of like, why do we have all the kids go eat lunch at the same time? And it does go to your idea that we all stay in the group. And the group, which is funny because I also feel like we have an over reliance or over emphasis on autonomy. Like the children have to learn independence.
Right.
You have to put on your coat by yourself. How could you be 3 and not put your coat on yourself? And
just, I love, so Tiffany says this, Tiffany Pearsall will say this when we're talking about this kind of thing. Like even a child, like we get annoyed because the child has put his coat on every day by himself. And one day he's whining and wants you to do it. And we get so annoyed because we know he can do it himself. And her view is like, he's inviting me to connect with him. Like he made it, this not even be about independence. This just might be his way of saying, Tiffany, I need you.
Right. How many of us have not asked our significant other to do something that we are physically capable of doing?
Right. Absolutely. Yes.
Hey, I've got to go to the store. Would you come with me?
Yeah.
It's like, you've gone shopping by yourself before. It's like, I know, but I'm making a big purchase and I just want you there. It's like, but you already decided what you're buying. Well, I know.
Okay, well, I just want you there. Yes.
Yeah, but we do it all the time to children. And when you just step back, and that's where the pause really helps. Why am I upset about this?
Right. What's happening in my own body right now?
Right.
And and what do I need to do so that I can support this little guy?
Right. And and connection is so often the thing, like in my case too. I was just trying to make sure all the kids had, were eating, were able to open their lunch things. So they bring their own lunch and whatever, like trying to make sure that the whole group, and there was another teacher too. So, but at the same time, also making sure that,
Yeah. Yeah.
But I wasn't even seeing the need was so obvious. Like he
right.
was
And we don't need
clear.
to wait for a diagnosis, I guess, to kind of bring it back to where we started. There doesn't
doing that.
Well, it's unusual, as you know, for me to do it. But so I'm thinking there was another little boy that we worked with at the speech language preschool several years ago who really showed a lot of autistic indicators, or whatever you want to say, and the parents didn't want that didn't want that test done. And so at that time we were working with grad students, and the grad students were like, well, what are we supposed to do then if we can't get a diagnosis? Well, you just look at what he needs, and we plan based on what he's showing us, whether he has a label or not. Maybe the label gets him more services that would benefit, but right now we just have this boy in front of us, and this is what he's showing us he needs and wants from us. So that's what guides us. And that was like, and then they were like, oh,
right. Yeah. I actually had a parent who, so I had the younger sister in my class at the time, but the older brother had gone off to elementary school, and the mom was telling me, yeah, the teacher the other day asked me, did the results get back? Does he have an ADHD diagnosis? And she said, oh, didn't get the results yet. And he's like, oh, I just want to know so I know what to do. And she said, why not just treat him as if he has ADHD?
Right.
Like, what would you do for the other kids? And in a way, I think we'd all do better if we just assumed everybody has ADHD, or everybody, whatever. I mean, and I mean, this is getting into like, well, it's not totally true that that idea of every child has a special need. Every child has needs, and every child has strengths. And it's not that you would make every kid do something that a kid with ADHD would do, but it's just that too often in our culture, the things we do expect of classrooms work against kids with ADHD. Those are some of the kids we exclude inadvertently, just with the culture that we've created for early childhood. Like not having enough movement, not allowing for more like individual, like this kid's going to go here and then there and then there, and it's like, no, you stay at your station for 15 or till the bell rings or whatever, and then all these things that different people do. And it's like, no, this child is not going to sit and listen to a book with the rest of the group. They're not going to stay at their station, whatever. And the more you do those things, but if you simply have it in a way that a child with ADHD would flourish, well, the child who does want to stay there 25 minutes could,
still can,
and the child who needs to move every 30 seconds, that's what that mom was getting at. And that's, I hope, what I'm conveying.
I think anything that we do because of an IEP or because of a diagnosis to benefit that specific child has benefits for everybody else in the room. Like I can't think of something, maybe when we were doing speech therapy, the child who just needed speech sound drills, maybe that's not going to benefit everybody.
Right.
But seeing the adults around make intentional efforts to meet those needs benefits every child in the room.
For sure. And I think IEP goals really should have what is the classroom changing? Not just what is the child doing.
Absolutely. I use IEP as an example. I think there's flaws in that system too, because it is very much all about how we get, at least everyone I've looked at, how do we get this specific child to change in ways that benefit the group, instead of
and often sort of things that relate to academics. Not necessarily social, like I shouldn't say any. A lot of times the social things listed are more about that child participating in a group,
fitting in instead of being
fitting
included,
rather than how do we help them play with other kids? How do we make sure that child is socially with others as much as they want to? I mean, obviously they can choose not to as well, but oftentimes social isolation is the biggest effect of a disability.
We had a 4 and then turned 5-year-old when I was working with him who had an IEP with a goal of joining play, being able to join play.
Excellent.
And it was really hard for him. He would kind of stand outside the group and throw something into the group, and that was like his signal that he wanted to join. But he was often doing his own play, and I actually had more success inviting others to come play with me and that child than say, let's help you join this scary group. And then it was a little bit easier to get him.
And that's often the way it is, because then when they come over, then that child is starting to get the experience of what social cues they are using, how they relate, and this, whatever.
Yeah.
This child's also interested in this part or this thing. And it gives them more skills.
Yeah. And it would just be like, oh, Eric's doing something really interesting. Come in, let's go over and see if we can play too. That kind of thing, instead of Eric would like to join your group. What?
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I often
that's great eventually, but that's really scary right away, I think. For
I usually teach kids, or whatever, if I'm coaching kids or whatever word you want to use, to play parallel. Yeah. Oh, you want to play with them? They're using blocks. Let's use blocks.
Yeah.
Near them, and that's going to be a lot easier to then bridge than just go join them in their play.
Right.
And then it's like, I remember one time doing that with a kid who just physically, wasn't as coordinated, so would put a block on the building and it would knock over the whole building.
Yeah.
And the other kids were much more adept at that.
Yeah.
And so they would just get really like, well, I'm not going to let him play with us,
because
look what happens when he does.
A stigma. Yeah.
Right. Versus him building a garage nearby or whatever, and they build the house or whatever, like something that could relate.
Yeah.
Oh, now it's like, he's not touching my building. Well, now we can play, he can, I can drive my car over and go to his restaurant.
His garage. Yeah.
His garage. Yeah.
Anyway, that's a whole other topic.
Yeah. But I think, see, those are some of the informational and attitudinal things that child needed to, well, one, what do these other kids like to play with? What are the things I need to do to kind of get that serve and return with with a child? Throwing something into the middle of them isn't the way to do that.
Right.
So that's the information that child needs.
Right.
And that's the barrier for that child being included.
Yeah.
So yeah. And I think going to your special needs, I think this is the last point.
Okay.
That idea that all children have needs and strengths and things. So I was talking with Remus, with my child, and they were talking about the way, well, yeah, so like I liked to climb trees, and there was this other kid who liked to climb trees. So when I was with him, I would climb trees. This is probably more elementary school now that I think about it, but then he also liked to get really loud when he was having a lot of fun, and my child can't deal with sensory issues and loud sounds. So then, well, when he was feeling that way, I would go over and play with this person because they like to play with dolls, and I could, sit down and, I would sort of make up a story for the dolls. Didn't actually use the dolls themselves, but so it's just that thing of what my child became adept at is noticing, oh, this is the thing I do with this kid. This is the thing I do with this kid. This is the thing I do with this kid. Eventually, I mean, it was probably like second grade. But in first grade, they just kind of sat there, like on the playground. They would just sit by themselves.
Yeah.
Because they weren't sure how to join a group, and they still, as an adult now, young adult, need help. Like, you got to tell your friends, like, I don't know when to, like, leave or come back when we're doing a thing, like being with a couple and having them say, oh, could we have some time alone? My child's not coming back the rest of the day. Well, they don't listen to your podcast, but yeah, because it was prom night, the three of them are hanging out, and like, like my child goes on the other side of the football field or whatever, and then like they're not sure, when do I come back?
Right. Well, that'd be hard for me to do.
Yeah, it's true. Right.
I would be the same way.
Yeah, but it's that thing of like, you got to let them know, this is the thing I need help with. I'm not ignoring you, because if I don't come back at the right time, this is a lot of autistic adults have this issue, right? Of, I'm not, like, don't take this personally that I'm ignoring you because I'm not coming back. It's because I'm not quite sure. And you're welcome to tell me. You're not going to hurt my feelings if it's like, oh, actually, could we have the rest of the night alone, or whatever it is, or the opposite of like, yeah, come on over, like, or if you're ready, come on over, whatever.
Right.
But just having that, like, that information, but just that idea, that awareness of, we need to help teach kids, oh, this part you can do with this child, but oh, this part doesn't work, or this child really likes to climb, your body is unable to climb trees if a child in a wheelchair. So when they want to play chase again, you could play with them. Right now they're climbing a tree. Let's find somebody who is doing something you can do, and you're going to do different things with different kids.
And that and the teacher has to then know that that's okay. Like, we don't have to say, oh wait, your friend wants to climb trees and she can't, so
right.
I don't want you in the tree right now. Just that we have to accept that it's okay for those things, that I guess those needs are fine. Those needs don't need to be sort of pathologized. They can just
be, exactly. That is just when you're truly included and you belong. It's like if you like reading, I like reading, but we might join different book clubs, and that's okay. It's not, well, I'm sorry, you're gonna have to. But there are sometimes group norms that you do, like we all have to get from the playground back into our classroom. That's the thing the whole group has to do. How that happens can look differently for different kids, but there are times when, well, we all have to get into the building. Whereas when you're playing, or other times when the kids can be independent, like we don't all have to climb trees right now. And we don't have to all stop climbing trees. We need enough activities that everyone has something they can do, I guess, is the way I'd say it. And so there are times, like everyone, like walking isn't better than rolling, isn't better than crawling, but we all need to get from point A to point B. And so that's the attitude. That's the part that if we prevent some of those things, the social barrier, we've just made a child unable, or we disabled the child from participating. I'm really glad that you introduced that so early in this, because it is something I wouldn't have on my own discovered, the social model. I'd already started writing the book when I heard Tom Shakespeare speak, and it was like, oh, this is just like this is, because I was trying to figure out how to connect it with like a lens of like cultural humility or stuff, and it like made sense in my head, but trying to explain it to anyone else, and suddenly I saw that and was like, oh, that's like so much better. And I always make sure I credit, and I probably need to credit other people too, from that. It's mostly the disability rights movement in England that came around, but I also have to say, like, I don't know enough. I don't mean to just credit one person for something that is a whole field.
From a lot of people.
He was someone who wrote about it. He has a book literally called Disability, a Primer, or or The Basics, or something like that. The
Basics, okay.
And then he has another one called The Disability Reader, and it's like the textbook. But to buy it in America costs a lot of money.
I haven't read that one yet. Happens.
So anyways, so credit to other people in the disability rights movement, and I whatever, I need to get more names in front of me so that I can credit more people.
Well, they can buy your book and look
but
at
it's not my there we go. It is not my I just want to say that it's not like the mind of Mike.
Sure.
In some ways, all I'm doing is connecting one idea to another, which for those of you who want to be authors, really that's all of us do. Is we connect ideas from something to something else. And then the next person will do that to our work at some point. No, it's a good thing. And even schema play theory is like someone took some ideas of Piaget and like, oh, but I'm noticing this. And now it's a different thing. And you don't notice it. That's why you have that's why you could, I and many writers have imposter syndrome at first, because, oh, this isn't new. But then after a while, it's like, oh, wait, I connected things in a way that no one had. That's the thing I did. So I'm making myself feel better in front of the listeners.
Oh, okay. All right, good.
I didn't realize I was doing that until I
No,
got
that's
to
fine.
the end there.
We talked about this already.
This is our therapy session, right? That's all these podcasts are.
Right, exactly. It's all just everybody feed my ego and listen to our ideas. Yeah. Okay, well, this was great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
I'm not exaggerating, and I don't think that my judgment is clouded because I like you as a person to say that this book is amazing and everyone should buy it. I think it really is amazing, and I'm going to get it in as many people's hands as I can.
Cool. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
But I am excited about it. So
yeah. Okay. I guess that was our any last things.
I think that's the last things. Yeah, the last things.
All right. Well, thanks for being on again. I always love it when you're on. And thanks everybody for listening to another episode. We'll be back next week.